No, it's good. And so welcome again. And we will have the pleasure to start with the first presentation by Professor Gibson Burrell. And then we will hear Professor Varda Wasserman. And then we will open the floor to questions. And do not hesitate to ask your question in the chat, or for the people following us with the live stream to send us the questions. And we will transmit your questions to Varda and Gibson. So Gibson, the floor is yours, and I look forward to hearing your talk. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for allowing me to speak in English, especially since Brexit and its foolishness. So, research group on collaborative spaces. Should we put a question mark after collaborative spaces? Collaboration, from the Latin, I imagine, means work together. But such an idea immediately raises the issue of working with whom? Who is one collaborating with? And I don't know about you, but some universities I've worked in, I look around me and think, I wouldn't like to collaborate with these people, even though I expected that I do. So collaborative spaces raises the question about who one is working with. And sometimes, as I say, this is a frightening prospect. So one doesn't have to be a follower of Sartre to realize that hell might be the others. And so this is why I've talking for these 20 minutes about critical spacing and the other, the importance of the other to collaborative spaces. So what I would like to do, let's just hope this works, yeah. So to begin with, given we're talking about critical spacing, what do we actually mean by critical? And I'm not going to go through these line by line, but simply point to this. And at the School of Management in Leicester, this is how these 6 or 7 points are what we saw as being critical and how we wanted to move the school. So the history of being critical obviously is a long one with a very broad and deep tradition, but these are the major points one might point to. So critique is about power and its distribution, and without a sense of power and its use, there wouldn't be any serious critique in place. So this will be my focus, but it's only one of 6 or 7. And I know that Varda is going to talk about resistance to power. So these two things tie in quite nicely, one hopes. Critique is also about being iconoclastic, about breaking down icons and the prevailing sets of imagery in the present day. And just for one, for example, organizational leader, seen as having an iconic status. But of course, once one starts to analyze leadership, followership immediately raises its head. So the intention of a critical analysis is to subvert the concept itself. So no icon is above critique, no symbol is beyond being unmasked. And that, of course, includes the concept of being critical itself. One has to see that as being immediately available for critique. Third, critique is about knowledge and the basis upon which our knowledge claims are erected. Critical approaches to knowledge assume that conventional forms of empirical science are more likely to lead to a superficial acceptance of the taken for granted, common sense. And I think it was Einstein who said common sense is a set of prejudices we learn by the age of 18 years. And the empirical taken for granted isn't very likely to look for ontological depth or epistemological complexity, and I think we should be doing that. Critique encourages an approach from the researcher which is investigative. That means we shouldn't take anything the establishment say as beyond critique. Fifth, I think critique or a critical perspective has to have some utopian vision behind it. Not necessarily a fully formed, worked out one, but at least some notion that things could be better and better along dimensions which would be better accepted. So there's a paramount reality has behind an image, however vague of a world, it's better. So it seems to me that to be critical, we have to have some hazy image of what a utopian world would look like. Critique in the 6th point, if done properly, is driven by a sense of intellectualism. That's the sense of excitement about some revelatory effect upon the user of a new set of ideas. And it would be daft, it would be foolish to believe that every student, every reader of our work would have the same experience. But critique is driven in part by the desire to teach, to spread the word. And again, to go back to the Latin, I think education comes from educare, meaning to lead out. So what critique is about is leading out by the illumination of new ideas. And finally, critique seems to me, if we're looking at critical spacing, is and was oppositional. That means what ties together these 6 strands, the binding, is a continual challenge to the powerful, to what is seen to be the orthodox, to what is seen to be the iconic, to what is seen as Panglossian, the best of all possible worlds. In short, what Deleuze and Guattari called royal science. So that's what I would mean by critical, and you get a sense, hopefully, from where I would come from looking at these issues. What about space? So at the end of the last century, the 1990s, we were told that the metaphor of movement in space was everywhere. This is obviously the tail end of postmodernism. In social theory, literary criticism, cultural theory, geography, and some of the most interesting stuff was in geography. This is a quote from Questwell from 97. Mobility is the order of the day. Nomads, migrants, travelers, and explorers inhabit a world where nothing is certain or fixed. Tradition and rootedness have the smell of death. Diaspora is everything. Monumentalism, the edifice, the rooted, the bound, are firmly placed in the museum of modernity. Well, I don't accept that, but clearly if one looks in Eastern Europe at the moment, the whole issue of mobility is definitely there. But the idea that Leach came up with, that power is no longer linked to space and architectural forms of little control over human behavior, seems to me to miss the point. So what I'm arguing is that in this century, in the 21st century, identity, nationalism, rootedness in the soil are primary fixations, and I use the word fixation advisedly there. These are fixations. They're not about mobility. They're about looking for the roots. And so the aesthetics, and it's more than the aesthetics, but of race, of nation, of blood, are reasserting themselves as spatially bound concepts. And I imagine that in the French elections, some of these things might occur, but it's not my place to talk about European issues. So critical spacing then has to be about the process of othering, because what one is talking about, is there a sense of the other, or is it all us, all we? So the search takes us to power in every space, in every place. And yet each space changes in function and structure over the years. So power, of course, is dynamic. And again, looking at resistance, we'll see that. But the traces of the past still exist. So critical spacing, what sort of methods am I going to use here? And it may be methods is a little strong, but what Karen and I have done in the past is use vignettes rather than doing contemporary empirical work, although Karen Dale in our joint work has done empirical work. But what is a vignette? The Oxford Dictionary says, a brief descriptive account, an anecdote, an essay, something short and evocative that shades the edges away from the subject. So vignettes I've found is quite useful because it allows one to look at history. It allows one not to look at the contemporary world, but to look deep into the past and find places and buildings and imagery which illuminate our present day. But of course, the past, as a number of people have said, is a foreign country. We don't understand the language of the past. And if we're historical or archaeological in our approach, we have to look for what contemporaries said. So one can do that a little bit in where places where languages happen to be written down. But visual imagery and the written text are not themselves enough. A single image can really mislead the analyst, so too can text. One piece of text can be really misleading, but so, of course, can direct observation. So that's simply to say, vignettes is a way of looking at contemporary critical spacing. So I'm going to look at 9 spaces by which to understand the 21st century, which of course is an appallingly grandiose sort of notion, but it's a way of trying to look at critical spacing and the other. So each of these 9 says something about the relationship between us in a collaborative space and the other. So the Plague Village. This is the village of Etam in Derbyshire, in the United Kingdom, in the Midlands. And what I put there is the dead are not always with us, because what you've got there is a stone graveyard with stone gravestones. Of course, many human beings have died in cultures based upon wood, and we have no record, even parch marks in the summer, of their existence. They have been lost, whereas this place is nicely contained as a place where people died in the plague in 1665, 1666 in the UK. And this is a cottage in the village, built in 1553, as you can see, but you just see how many members of the family died in less than 12 months. Thomas Wilson dies just before Christmas 1665. Sarah Wilson dies in September 1666. The thing about the village was it quarantined itself. It allowed no one to leave, nobody wanted to leave. And luckily or unluckily, depending on your view, the priest died quite early on in the during the visit of the plague, and the local people decided themselves not to move out, to stay exactly where they were. And as you see in West End Cottage, they stayed there for 10 months, and every single member of the household died. Now, is that relevant? Well, of course, it's very relevant to the present time. So this was avoiding others. The other was avoided. Nobody was invited to the house. Members of the house did not leave it, and this had lethal effects. Now, William the Conqueror, as we call him, William of Normandy, when he went to the north of England, found it devoid of civilization. I come from the north of England, so I can say that. And this was a place in Durham that he built, and it's the cloistered place in Durham Cathedral, right next to Durham Castle. Now, the cloister is somewhere where you walk without others. You simply walk with those that you share your intellectual and spiritual desires with. So you walk without others. These are places that became universities. And of course, the other is excluded by the nature of the architecture, but the nature of the walls we build around us, intellectual as well as physical. Here's the Tower of Babel, another image. Now, the Tower of Babel is often remembered for the babel of voices, for the babel of different languages that are in competition with each other. But it's often forgotten that God, in her or his wisdom, actually breaks up the linguistic order that exists in the Tower of Babel. Prior to this, as the tower is built, everyone speaks the same language. The tower becomes a threat to this God because humans believe that they can build as high and can share the power of a shared language. So the Tower of Babel is held up often as where people's language is totally different. But actually, in its beginning, it's talking without others. Everyone shares a language. The Tower of Babel would not allow others to be within it. Another place that one has written about is the Vasari Corridor, which is the thing going across the top of the windows in Florence. And it's a wonderful example of superiority. because the elite of Florence would not dirty their dresses and their shoes with the excrement that one finds at street level with the people. They walked along the corridor from the Uffizi to their palace, maintaining a sense of superiority. And in English, we get the phrase looking down on others from a lofty height. And this is what, it's not a very good picture, sorry, but above the smell of the butcher's shops, which is what one found below, we, ourselves, us, in inverted commas, bother to look only at ourselves. There are one or two windows in the Vasari Corridor, but what the elite of Florence did was to look at themselves. What they were concerned to do was to walk down this corridor and look at pictures of their ancestors, their contemporaries, and they were portraits. And this often is what collaborative spaces are about too. We look at those with whom we collaborate and not downwards into the street at the butcher's block. And we certainly don't smell the crowd which we have othered ourselves. Now this, I like this example, sorry. Samuel Winchester developed the Winchester repeating rifle, so he was an arms manufacturer. And he built this particular house, which becomes called the Mystery House. It's in San Jose in California. The trouble was, he and his wife immediately believed that as soon as the house was built, it became populated by the ghosts of those people that had been shot with Winchester rifles. So it's full of ghosts representing the unwelcome insertion of the other. It was meant to be, a very private estate, but the wealthy Winchester family immediately believed it became populated with ghosts. And so this is Mrs. Winchester's bedroom after Mr. Winchester died, Sam Winchester. This is her bedroom, but she changed her bedroom every night because she was convinced if she stayed in it more than one night, the ghost of Sitting Bull, the famous Sioux chief, would visit her because Sitting Bull, guess what, had been shot with a Winchester repeating rifle. So Mrs. Winchester changed her bedroom every night to avoid the ghost of Sitting Bull. And this is avoiding the other. This is in a collaborative space, never allowing anyone in there who has a ghostly sort of presence. A Chinese factory, I think it's China, for Apple. No possible room for otherness here. Everyone wears a uniform. Everyone looks like they're doing identical jobs. Now, in the Anglo-Saxon individualist world, an American, I suspect, would say, well, of course they'll express their individuality. Their underwear will be different. Their socks will be different. They'll have tattoos which are different. I'm not so sure. I don't know enough about Chinese culture. But it does look like an image of total homogeneity. It looks like a collaborative space where there is no othering going on whatsoever. But part of me thinks, what form does resistance take? And it may be that Vara has a particular line on this. This is the ship at sea. And one of the most fascinating things about this is organization theorists have discovered just how the warship in particular, but not only the warship, the merchant ship, actually carries culture with it. So maps are designed so you know where you are in relation to home. The chronometer decides where you are in time. But the thing about this one, it's a British ship, a French ship, a Portuguese, a Spanish ship would be the same. This is a Chippendale, very expensive table. There's an Axminster rug to the left. And the cannon reminds one it's a warship. But what we're seeing here is the transportation of one's own space over thousands of miles. What is carried on board ship is an essential remembrance of a distant home. So the other is excluded as best as possible by taking home with you. This is just a foolish picture of Milton Keynes And the tradition of the agora in Athens, when they built this new town of Milton Keynes, they call this area the agora. It looks a lot less like an agora than a shopping center that's about to be demolished. But it's the borrowed other. It's the fact that if you take the word agora, and lots of people have, it's this notion that you bring Greek classical thinking with you. But it just seems to me totally sort of ironic. This is the last picture, and there's one more overhead after that. This is Silicon Roundabout, so-called in East London. And it's a David Cameron concept. Remember David Cameron? We just about do. David Cameron made a visit there, was told that there were lots of interesting things going on, and gave it the name and borrowed the name Silicon Roundabout. It's meant to be collaborative workspaces. It's meant to be the future. A Google laboratory was set up there. But of course, this circle comes full circle because very little has gone in there since COVID. Since the end of 2019, the whole place apparently is deserted. Collaborative working is not going on in the real world. It's going on, as we are doing, many of us, virtually. So what I've tried to do there is simply vignettes about the different ways in which power and the other come together in ways historically that, you know, become emblematic. So this is the final overhead from me. A number of colleagues that I've had in the past have been academics, but they've also been part of anarchist communes. And they're predicated upon a shared collaboration, where collaboration, as we all imagine, means working together. But they've broken down. And the problem about why they've broken down is the problem of the other. There's this whole problem about what we mean by oneself. But it's very difficult to find other colleagues who have identical agenda to oneself. What about gender differences, age differences, differences in ethnicity, all sorts of other cleavages that they exist in the social world? So these are a set of questions. Aren't these insurmountable offerings to full collaboration? Can collaboration ever rest on anything but assumed homogeneity of the Apple factory? The third one down here is a very Anglo-Saxon sort of individualistic one. But isn't the concept of oneself not full of otherings in its own right? It was in the UK Mother's Day on Sunday, and the whole issue about is one a mother or is one a daughter? These are different roles, and the concept of oneself, you know, one shifts in these roles. Myself of today versus myself of 40 years ago, they're very different selves. So is there an I fully committed to collaborating if parts of me do not even wish to collaborate with each other? So, you know, the psychological tensions in ourselves mean that there's a huge range of collaborative issues. So how do we escape existential issues of critique of ourselves and critique of others when faced with the obvious advantages of democratic collectivism? I think there are obvious advantages of democratic collectivism. You know, they're hugely important, but in a collaborative space, how does one maintain that and get people to background their sense of othering that is going on? So as a last line, in order to speak about these issues, do we need to bite our tongues? So again, in English, it's the idea that we don't say what we really think, but in order to speak and to act. And that's a tension, I think, that we have in thinking about collaborative spaces. So that's what I had to say. I'm not sure how long I've taken, but I'm going to stop sharing and pass back to Francois.
Thank you very much, Gibson. What I propose is that we move to the second presentation before the collective discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to be here. I was asked by Francois to talk today about space as an emancipatory tool and to tell you a bit about my study vis-a-vis this question. So let me start my short answer to the question whether space can emancipate. And my short answer is, as more or less as Gibson said, no, not really. But let me a little bit elaborate on my cynical attitude to this question, which I'm not sure if it has to do with my age and experience or with my pessimistic disposition, which is already an inherent part of me as a critical sociologist. For the longer answer to Francois' question, I would like to draw on resistance studies and share with you my very initial thoughts about this question. I do have to say first that I base my argument on the assumption that resistance generates some emancipatory and agentic elements. Based on this assumption, I would like to pinpoint today three possible levels of spatial resistance, or if you want, we might call them emancipatory level of spacing. And I'll talk today about denial, space jamming, and appropriation. So let me start with the first, the denial of space. We can easily agree that architecture is an act of coercion. Through the location of doors and walls, it forces us to move in specific routes and not in others. It dictates colors and design styles that we might like or not. It prescribes how much sunlight and the view we can have through the window. But how can we resist this act of coercion? Let me elaborate with a short story which also relates to one of my earliest articles. The Open University of Israel, where I work, was relocated in 2004 from a small crowded building next to Tel Aviv University to a new, impressive, spacious building located in a more peripheral setting. Although the new building is much larger and has solved the physical overcrowding in the former building, most employees rejected this relocation, especially because it had distanced them from the vivid, lively city of Tel Aviv. At the beginning, employees, including myself, I have to admit, refused to come to work and worked mostly from home. Well, you have to remember, this was before the COVID, yes, and this was not such a common practice. I have to admit that even those rare occasions where I had to come to the new campus, I would sit in the cafeteria or in the gardens outside and not in what I considered an ugly office, which I'll show you in a minute. This was not a blunt refusal of mine. I did not say, no, I won't come. But de facto, I didn't come into the office. From this example, I think I skipped one. Yeah, from this example, From this example, we can assume that this type of resistance is usually triggered by organizational relocation or redesign, though I'm not sure whether it's exclusively only in these cases. Refusal, or what I just called space denial, is a kind of an emancipatory act that grants employees the feeling that they have the freedom to refuse the new space enforced upon them. This type of resistance acts about this type of resistant act is about the attempt to block the coercive power by simply saying no. This is a classical image of resistance because it is usually visible, although, as in my case, it was not so visible. However, although the power may be blocked, there are two problems with this kind of resistance. First, the effects are usually temporal, since the dominator, the university management in this case, has responded to this refusal by forcing everybody to come to campus and threaten them with sanctions and punishments. Here, the direct refusal of the employees was met with further coercive control. So we can easily see that refusal is risky because it may result in a high cost for those who resist. Second, although employees felt at first emancipated and free, the flow of domination was maybe undermined a bit, but not really changed. So we're talking here a struggle that has two parts, but both practice power in a specific manner. I do not want to complicate it further, but I just want to say that the management itself was also resisting the architect, who had dictated several aesthetic issues, such as hanging pictures in the hallways and etc. I will not go into this, but what is more important here is that this example suggests that power is not held exclusively by one entity, even when it comes to the management of an organization. Power, as Gibson also already said, is fluid, is dynamic, and so are resistors. In this case, even the management itself was not free to do what they wanted. So the question of emancipation is a complicated question because it is a multi-layered, fluid, and changing. It is often characterized by contradictory dynamics of control and resistance, rather than a coherent struggle between those who dominate space and demand obedience and those who resist it. So this is the first. The second emancipatory practice of space is what I called in a previous article aesthetic jamming, which refers to the various ways of spatial disruption. It ranges between the spontaneous, unorganized act of sticking maybe the wrong coin in a supermarket cart to a more or less organized or pre-planned act of sabotaging visual symbols in a specific public sphere in a way that makes it convey a message that contradicts the corporate interests. We use this term in the context of organizational aesthetics to conceptualize how the jamming or the disruption spaces were reversed or at least changed, and how they change the organizational messages. Let me elaborate on how power and resistance are interrelated in this case. We all acknowledge the fact that managements often use architecture and symbols to send the messages about how to behave in a specific space. For instance, to talk quietly in a prestigious restaurant. Although one is not forced to obey the scripts, we usually do that because we foresee future expressions of power and thus comply with what we assume are the wishes of the powerful. In organization, it's the management, of course. But what happens when we disagree with these messages? Of course, we can sabotage the symbols and artifacts that broadcast these messages. But how? I want to suggest three types of aesthetic jamming: discursive, embodied, and emotional. I want to demonstrate these three disruptions through my research on the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and by using Lefebvre's theory. The ministry was relocated in the year 2002 to a much lauded and impressive building, which was also rewarded as one of the most beautiful buildings in the world in the year 2004. However, it also has been the focus of employees' resistance. Why did the employees resist the new building and how did they do it? So at the discursive level, I will focus, based on Lefebvre's conceived space, on the planning, discourse, and the conceptualization of space by architects and managers in relation to the desired identity that the building was meant to project. The new building was primarily aimed at advancing a new professional culture, which was defined in terms of being presentable to overseas guests. As we can see in this quote, which I will not read, but you can definitely see that it was meant to be professional, formal, orderly, something that definitely is not Israeli. Yeah, okay. The second way of disrupting space is more material in its name. Sorry, I skipped something. Here, this is it. Yes. Okay. Now I see what's written down. Okay. The architectural and the managerial message was clear. The new building will enforce employees to adopt new work habits of respectability and discipline, orderliness and cleanliness, formality and representativeness. But if you are familiar with Israeli culture, you already know that this demand does not resonate with Israeli culture, which is much less formal and much less disciplined, a bit like Italians. So to resist the respectfulness of the building, employees used to mock the design of the building and to convert the desired interpretation of the aesthetic images into subversive one. For example, workers refer to the prestigious onyx stone that adorn the elegant entrance by Chinese porcelain, or they even called it the Great Bathroom from Gaza, to symbolize something cheap and unpretentious. The association with Gaza and Arabs was meant to link the building with Mediterranean locality, to undermine the managerial attempt to associate the building with the West and the global diplomatic world. Emancipation here is achieved through what Goffman called role distancing, namely when an individual intentionally promotes a lack of attachment and commitment to the role or does not fully engage in a role's performance. In this case, the employee wanted to send the message that they were free from the burden of the images that the management wanted them to adopt. Therefore, the struggle here is around identification with organizational values, images. I don't know, you see that, huh? Okay, never mind. I was told that okay, never mind. The second way of disrupting space is more material in its nature. From the managerial and architectural perspective, the desired professionalism was translated into exclusive and expensive materials. Unique and expensive materials, unique zinc, marble, glass, for instance, yes, all these were used to emphasize the exclusivity and the sophisticated building technology. However, employees used several material practices to disrupt the spatial exclusivity. For instance, there were several acts of vandalism and dirt aimed to harm the Western professional image. A number of employees presented guests with a photo album from the previous compound and explained to them that despite all the splendor that you will see now, the real Israel is the one that was before. And there was also intentional noise. Some employees played music on the speakers of the phones, talked and laughed very loud. One of the interviewees also told me, "No one will tell me how to speak. Here is not England." Another way was placing a colorful picture at the request of workers who wanted to present a more authentic and vivid Israeli culture. So the black and white picture were replaced by colorful pictures. And lastly, the Orientalization of space. Contrary to the instruction of for uniformity and aesthetic restraint, many workers hang tapestries from South America and from the Far East. And in one departure, they also placed a Persian rag with the aim of breaking the monotonous and the Western line that the planners wanted to preserve. And the last discursive, the last way of spatial disruption is more emotional. Professionalism, I don't know, it doesn't move. I don't know why. Ah. Oh, here it is. Yes. Okay, I have to move it. Okay. Yes. Professionalism, formality, and Westernness were values that employees not only did not identify with, they interpreted space differently than how the planners wished. For instance, many employees perceived the emphasis on Western side as a symbol of arrogance, or if you want, as Gibson said, as othering, and even ethnic exclusion. They felt that it excluded all guests and employees whose origin is not from the West. So until now, we discussed two types of spatial resistance. I'll just put this again up. I don't know why I can't get rid of it. So until now, we discussed two types of spatial resistance that grant employees to some extent with agency and the feeling of emancipation, refusal and spatial jamming. Now we turn to the third type, appropriation. Appropriation is defined as the process by which each person, whether consciously or unconsciously, claim the right for their surrounding space and adapt it to their own needs and taste. Let's go back to the Open University. Well, here you see on the left, you can see my room at the beginning. Okay, it looks like that, quite ugly, I would say. And on the right, this is how it looks today. I think it's better. Now I do not refuse to come to work anymore. Yes, I'm coming. And it's understandable since I made this room to be mine and nobody else's. This is completely me. It's colored, it has strong colors, it has posters that remind my research topics. This cannot be someone else's room, but only mine. So this is how appropriation looks like. Of course, there are two important things to explain here. First, the act was not really allowed, although I have to admit that I did ask for it, but nobody helped it. I had to paint the wall by myself. Second, the act of resistance has spread, and others have renovated the room afterwards. Recently, I have to tell you, even the vice president of the university consulted me as to how to renovate his room in the same spirit. So in a way, we can say that I succeeded, and this kind of resistance was routinized and institutionalized. But what was I rejecting? I was rejecting probably the anonymization, yes, of the standard design, its pale colors, its formality, and even in its masculinity. In other words, appropriation is a resisting act against the power of subjectivation. Many scholars and organizational aesthetics have already described space as regime of identity formation and identity scapes, if you want, emphasizing the ways in which physical arrangement within the workspace are used as identity markers. Simple example, of course, may be the size of an office or the chair that one uses to signify hierarchical position and professional identity. But space has also a significant role in constructing gender, ethnic, and other identities, although not much has been written about that. For instance, in another paper that we did on the Israeli ministry, we have shown how space was experienced by women as masculine. However, many women have appropriated the space and were active in enacting the space. While senior female managers have reproduced the existing design and further masculinized the office with hanging authority symbols such as awards and pictures with very important people, secretaries have domesticated and feminized it, resisting the boring design, as they have called it. So, does appropriation grant emancipation? Again, I will try to move that. Never mind. Okay, never mind. Does emancipation really grant emancipation, or at least some agentic power? What if women could design space that is suited to their needs? Would that be bring them the desired emancipation? In a recent study, which I conduct with Michal Frankel and my PhD student, which is here, Sigal, we examined how a group of female entrepreneurs who have established a co-working space for women only claim the right for space of their own and designed it in a way that is more feminine. I will not talk about co-working spaces for women, but I will say that co-working spaces for women have begun to pop in many large cities around the world. And the methods conveyed by these spaces is a feminist claim for space, as they are built and designed by women, for women, in order to offer a home away from home. However, I will talk about it in ego, so I'll leave you curious about that. I don't want to depress you too much, but also in these spaces, where appropriation is so extensive and intentional, power and control are very prevalent and emancipation is limited. So with this depressing message, I want to conclude and say that the emancipatory power of space affords some freedom, but it is very limited. This table concludes my initial thoughts about space and resistance. And as you can see, each type of spatial resistance is each type of resistance resists some type of power, and the power it's a struggle over something. Well, this is only initial, and we can think about it together. But this is how I was trying to explain today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Varda. Thank you. Thank you to Gibson as well. What I propose to all of you is to open the pad, because we did our best to copy paste all the questions coming here or from the outside. So if you click on it, and maybe I can just quickly read what came. So we have some questions and comments for Gibson. In relation to the other, is there in English a semantic link between guest and ghost? Second remark or question, is the problem otherness or commons? Is what you describe simply a metaphor or more than a metaphor? What about non-altruistic spaces in academia? Then we have questions and comments for Varda. Is aesthetics a way to resistance? Is it possible to resist aesthetically through space? Or is the idea of spatial jamming different from objectal resistance? Doesn't the resistance of the employees, which leads to strategies of discrediting the architecture, translate a lack of consideration through a true consultation and association to the reflection around what should be the space which is proposed to them? And then we have questions and comments for both of you. What about critique as an activity? Is it possible to complete a critique through special practices? I assume critique is different from resistance or emancipation. And second John comment, can academic conferences contribute, be critical spaces, contribute to critical spaces or critical spacing? So are you inspired by these questions or comments? It's a way to launch the discussion. It's a lot of comments, but
terrifying.
I guess.
Shall I just begin with the two that there are for me up front and then stay quiet for a bit? in relation to the other, is there in English a semantic link between guest and ghost? There may be, but I'm not sure what it would be. The concept of the ghost, I think, is very well developed in Northern Europe, most places, isn't it? But the idea of a guest, let's say in the Winchester house, and a ghost. Mrs. Winchester, and I should know her first name, but I can't remember it. She certainly saw the ghosts as not being guests, as being very, very unwelcome. But again, 5 letters. They say in English that consonants between words are not really significant. They're only slightly more significant than vowels. So for those of you with a linguistic background, it's the idea that you can't trace these things down at all. So sorry, that's no answer. The second one for me, and the last for a while, is the problem otherness or the commons? There's no the in there, but the commons. I think that's a really interesting one too. Maybe otherness is not a problem, but it seems to me for collaboration it is. And clearly the notion of the commons is something which a number of writers have written about. It's become a very important sort of concept. But again, there are fracture lines, there's fragmentations, there's there is a word here, I forgot what it is. The creation of gaps between things. I mean, if you want to find homogeneity, you will find homogeneity. You know, if you go into a situation looking for likeness, you can find it. If you go into a situation looking for difference or difference, you will find it. So I think the problem for me in the talk, in the 25 minutes or whatever, was otherness, but it's linked, the notion of otherness and its links to the common. Otherness is much more of an ontological state, whereas the commons, I think, is a politico-economic sort of notion. So does that make any sense? I don't know, but they seem to me in separate orders of discourse. I shall be quiet for a little while.
Okay, I'll do the same. I'll start with a question that I can see here. This is a question of Edith Pratt. Well, I'm not sure whether the problem is that they were not consulted and the architects have enforced a specific design, although of course designers and architects tend to do that, but this assumes that there is a perfect architecture, or there is something that is fixed and it's not dynamic and it doesn't change. And I believe that there is no thing like that. I mean, even if they were consulted, the employees, they would reject it because power is always there. So if power is there, they will always resist it in a way, in one way or another, but power will always be rejected. And I don't think that consulting with the employees is the way to avoid power through space. So I'm not sure I'm very optimistic, but I did say that I am a pessimistic person. So this is about the question I see here. Is there another one that I don't see? No, this is here.
No, there are other ones, but not in the chat, in the pad.
Okay, now, Gibson, you want to start with the chat, or I will?
No.
Could you do that? I'm reading. Is it?
Maybe before opening the floor to a more focused discussion on the people who are in the loop of the Zoom, just a question for both of you I found interesting. It appears at the end of the pad. It's the question about a critique. Critique as an activity. which could be a different activity from emancipation or resistance. Because in your talk, that's also my impression. I think you mainly discussed about resistance, emancipation, but not strictly about critique as an activity, kind of a philosophical activity. It was the starting point of your talk, Gibson, but in the vignette that you proposed several times, I had the intuition that you were talking more about resistance or emancipation than critique in the philosophical sense of the term. So what is your view about space and critique, the possibility of a critique through space in corporations, in organizations, in academia?
Is that me rather than you, Vara?
Sorry, what did you say?
Sorry. So if I pick that up first, then because I think there was material in there for you as well. I didn't think I was saying very much about resistance. I knew that Vara was going to talk about that. And, you know, I've become very, very pessimistic about the possibilities of resistance. It may be living in Britain in 2022, but my God, it seems to me really, really hard to conceptualize successful resistance. So I didn't say very much about that, but partly that was because Vara and I had a conversation beforehand. But the role of the critic, it can be much broader or much narrower, I think, than one imagines. Does the critic have to be active? Does the critic have to be an activist? Well, clearly, a literary critic doesn't necessarily have to be. It seems to me that the tradition is definitely one of a commitment to action, a commitment to trying to bring about various forms of change. But again, you know, in my time of life, one becomes much more pessimistic about how that is. I was probably at my best in 1968, which tells you something. And the sense of excitement, of enthusiasm, the belief in changes, not only in Paris and France, but even in the UK, was phenomenal. And, you know, it was an exciting time to live. But since then, it's definitely gone backwards as far as I can see. None of which answers your question, Francois, but I think that the philosophical concept of critique and its link to critical theory in that, you know, continental European sense is one that we have to hang on to because it's rooted in praxis, and praxis, it seems to me, is the way forward. So sorry for those of you that are much younger and energetic and enthusiastic. Just keep that as long as you possibly can. But compared to 68, what we get in 2022, my God, it's depressing. Sorry.
Well, I'm with Gibson on that. I'm also pessimistic. I did not talk about successful resistance. I don't think resistance is very successful usually. I think it usually reproduces power, and if it doesn't reproduces them, it changes how they are performed or enacted. As I said, from the example about the women-only spaces, power exists in different ways. Maybe not the traditional one, not the one that we are familiar, but resistance is never successful. Even when the vice president asked me to reappropriate his own office, so I'm also pessimistic about that. The critique as an act is something I think that both employees are doing, but definitely much more we as researchers. This is our position. I, as a researcher always criticizes every space, every organizational space that I can see. I was really wanted to tell you that I wanted to be an architect once. This was my dream. But then I found something much better, to criticize architecture, the designs of others. Nothing can be better than that. So I believe that this is a position, it's a epistemological position that I have in regard to how I look at spaces. So critique is my job. This is what I'm doing. But of course, resistance, it relies, it draws on it. And I think that also people who use the space, they have this basic position of critique because they have to use it, and it's often uncomfortable. So it is the action, it is the basis of things. You cannot do it without it. But yes, I agree completely with what Gibson presented here. It's a more intellectual position, and it's more of us. Now, what am I supposed to answer?
No, maybe at this stage we can move to the room, and I see many people in the room now that have been working on space and doing ethnographies of space and exploring political issues and social dynamics in the context of space. So I don't know if you have some comments or questions based on what you just heard and the relationship between space and critique, or space and power, which is not that present about the topic of collaborative spaces, as we had already the opportunity to discuss. It's not that present. There is this idea that came in many discussions with some practitioners that join our discussion, that it's fun, it's gamified, it's cool. In many ways, power is not there, or it's not really a problem. But as many of you saw in, for instance, in co-working spaces and with communities of entrepreneurs, these issues are always present, these issues of power. So any comments or questions in the context of our space? I really look forward to physical events, on-site events. That's what we used to do because it's really different, that kind of interactions.
I'm just reading Anne Conliff's response, which is very, very interesting. There's been some very interesting stuff on the etymology of the words, and presumably in Sweden, I think this is Emily, is it? In Sweden, it's called an umlaut, is it?
What is it called? Sorry, in Sweden, what?
Is it an umlaut, the two dots?
Oh, yes, it's an umlaut. Yeah, like in German.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Does the umlaut not have huge significance?
No, it has no significance.
Okay.
It's only about sound, actually. So if I pronounce it, it goes like gast and yes. Actually, yeah, it changes the G, but yeah, I'm writing a highly philosophical paper about this, and the ghost. So Derrida has said some things about ghosts, but I would want to relate this with otherness. But then I'm wondering, yes, the guest is also a kind of ghost, in a sense, that because if the guest, the unexpected guest, or if the guest stays too long, it becomes frightening. So that's, well, that's how I try to relate them. But I would like Gibson, if I could, as long as I have the words, I was really amazed when I read your really old article about sexuality in organizations, and the way you wrote about cloisters. if I remember well, because it was a long time ago I read it. So,
Yeah.
and that is something that is missing also today, to speak about, to speak frankly about, the issue of sexuality in organizations, and how it can be part of a constructive resistance. Mm.
It's that becomes such a huge issue, doesn't it? Because many years ago I taught about desexualization, but and resexualization, but a huge number of people, many of whom were my friends, pointed out immediately that that becomes an incredibly dangerous sort of notion. Resexualized for whom, for what purpose? And as soon as the gender issues they get surfaced very, very quickly. So yeah, a number of my colleagues pointed that out, and I think they were quite correct. But again, space and the notion of the cloistered elite, I think becomes really, really important in terms of university settings, and the power that the monastery has, the power that the monks have. We've seen that, without making a religious point about it, but in the Roman Catholic Church, that sort of inward-looking, huge concentrations of power through the architecture, I think, are really important.
Just a last comment. You say inward-looking. Then, if we think about what sexuality is about, and emotions and embodiment, and also Varda touched upon this topic, it is exactly about looking out from. So that's to lead out also this educare, you said. So
Yeah.
the fact to get out from something, and we are totally as sexualized in organizations today. It does not exist as an issue. So, well, but it's a complicated issue. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Bob Cooper, who I used to work with, talked about the difficulties in defining inside and outside. And the way in which, as soon as we breastfeed or whatever, the outside becomes part of the boundary between inside and outside is really difficult to mark. And it's very, very strong in organization theory, because the notion of some sort of bounded entity. But the more one looks at it, the more difficult that sort of idea of inside, outside becomes. It's useful. We use it every day. Yeah. I'm looking outside at snow, and the snow is not inside, please God. But, when we're talking about the human body and embodiment, it becomes much more problematic.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. And yes, you started reacting, Gibson, to Anne's questions about North American academic space and the possibility of resistance in this context.
Once you start me on this, I'm very difficult to shut up. So sorry. I've been to the American Academy on a number of occasions, and I think it's absolutely horrendous. It's hierarchicalism. You can see it spatially. The great old men that stand around wearing Bermuda shorts and Hawaiian shirts, and the less powerful are more and more formally dressed the further away you get from the great man. There are some great women now. The way in which, when I went in the 80s, it was so highly sexualized, in order to get your first post in a university as a woman, there was the casting couch, if you know what I mean, and I certainly saw that. Absolutely dreadful expressions of hierarchy, the worst sorts of things, and they are still there in terms of the domination of the journals, the way in which whole areas of intellectual life are excluded. I wrote a piece many, many years, everything I say is many, many years ago, sorry, but about Michel Foucault, and I sent it to ASQ, which you will all know. And one of the reviewers said, why should we be interested in a dead French philosopher? And I wasn't sure which was the most heinous crime. Was it to be dead? Was it to be French? Or was it to be a philosopher? All of those three things were unacceptable. And it seems to me that the academy is the same. You may have followed instances of the previous president of the academy having to defend herself from critique of the way in which the academy did not stand up to Trump. A very difficult situation, because I imagine Trump supporters belong to the American Academy in some number. And, you know, it's possibly dangerous in America at certain points to say negative things about that particular president. Sorry, I could go on and on and on, but as a stance, I think we have to maintain a pro-European intellectual position against pragmatism. Pragmatism is such a dangerous philosophical position if you happen to live this side of the Atlantic, it seems to me. Back to space.
And yes, because we put aside this question, which I think is interesting for or could be interesting for both of you, the question of conferences and academic events. So it's a very interesting spatial context, very interesting traditional space for domination. There are conferences, sometimes interactive workshops, but at the end, people come from far, they pollute a lot, and it doesn't produce at all anything interesting politically, no manifesto or any. So is there a different way we could space that kind of events to build a collective critique? Let's use this very concrete example of the conferences, places where we meet together. What could we do differently to build a collective critique? What is your view? What is your experience about that?
Sorry, again, do you want to go first, Varda?
I don't have an answer for that. It's a very good question. I guess it's very easy where if you have a group that everybody are, you know, critical about the same things, but what happens when you go out? What happens when you meet the powerful ones or the one who dominate? So I'm not sure that conferences can be that. Definitely not on the academy, but even in English, I'm not sure that this is enough. But because in the end, what we live is not these annual conferences. What we live is the spaces that we live in, the spaces that we work in, and these will last forever. they will always enforce specific movements and embodiments and thoughts and emotions on us. And I'm not sure whether the conferences, I mean, we can do that as a, you know, as a group to have a collective resistance, if you want, or somebody also asked about it, a collective resistance, which is not only gives us a sense of, it can give us a sense of a subjective emancipation, but it will not really have it cannot really undermine the power relations which we all live as employees, and not only us but also others. So I don't know, I'm not sure I'm very optimistic about this option, but as I said, it's the age. I'm a little bit pessimistic already.
Yeah, the notion of the academic conference is the spectacle, and the way in which it's built up as sometimes a contest between particular speakers. Sometimes it's about trying to find a job and, you know, being spectacular or spectacularized in that sense. like you, Francois, I've very rarely been to a conference where you come away and you think, I'm so energized by that. My only tip is to go to Copenhagen Business School social events. That's what I found in conferences, because the amount of free alcohol there is huge. And that's a dreadful indictment of my conference going. But Copenhagen Business School, the amount of alcohol there, fantastic. And that gets you through most of the conference, whatever conference it is.
It could be great concluding words, what you just said, but maybe just a last reaction to something. I had a discussion recently with PhD students, and they had this idea. It looks like an idea of the 60s, the period you described. They said that there should be specific conferences for and by PhD students, not doctoral consortium, but self-managed events, spaces for mutual help. And first I thought it's a brilliant idea, it's great, but wouldn't it introduce different kind of dominations, different kind of horizontal violences at the end without any possibility of regulation? What is your view about that kind of alternative events, more horizontal events, self-managed events? Is it a space for hope, to conclude with some light? Is hope in this direction? Or...
Well, as Anne said, it's pockets of guerrilla resistance. I love this term. It's nice. Pockets of guerrilla resistance. It is. I think, again, I think it's temporary. I think it can, until they are institutionalized, the PhD student, they probably will be like everybody else in the end, no?
I think it's really important as an idea. And, it's a phrase in English, youth is wasted on the young. But if you are young and you've got the energy, you can overcome some of these things. And if you've got the ability to say to whoever's organizing a PhD session, it's time that you listened, or it's time that you did something differently. I think that's really important. The way in which it is possible to have alternative forms of journals. I mean, Ephemera, which some of you, all of you may know, has had some fantastic stuff over the years. Now, that's not to say, as an outsider, it hasn't had its tensions. Tensions between people who seek leadership roles and so on. But it has produced some great stuff. But it's so threatening to the established journals, they work against it getting any status. So a PhD group of people forming some sort of network would find it difficult to get funding, for example, difficult to get publications out of it. The classic structures of power would ensure it was much more difficult. And then, okay, so you find sponsorship. I mean, my experience, sorry, I'm about to start on another one, sorry. Another line of critique. Sage, I have found dreadful as a publisher, and yet they're held up as a group that are supportive and so on. They're such a money-making operation. Think, folks, about how we labor for the benefit of the publisher. We work for nothing, basically. If we're reviewing, if we're writing, publishing, and who takes that? Tesco, which is a big British supermarket, has about 4% return on capital per annum. Sage, the publisher, has 84% per annum return on capital. Now, where's that coming from? Look around the space in front of you, from us, from you. But try and say that. Try and get. I'm a member of the British Academy of Social Sciences, and I said, why are we taking Sage money, for prizes? And I was told, well, we need to get money from somewhere. We are locked in to self-exploitation on behalf of not only the publishers but others. But the publishers are dreadful. So now I've consigned American academic life and the publishers to the dustbin of history. Nobody will notice.
Any final reactions to our discussion? It's not a very optimistic discussion at the end.
Never promised you that.
No, never.
Yeah.
No, any final remark?
No, thank you very much. It was really interesting to listen to these two approaches, and I hope that alcohol will not bring down all academics. Absolutely.
No. And I did mean pragmatism as the American philosophical approach.
Yeah, you mean that, huh?
Yeah. I don't mean just the general.
Okay, good. Because
yeah.
I was wondering.
With a capital P.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we in France, I think we have some hope, because we have all the great philosophers that we can read, and
they're dead. Did you forget they're dead?
Yeah. No, they live in us. So that's, and also France is the only country where the state is actually present in each individual in a way. So. Well, we will see.
Yes, but Emily, in France there is this idea of intellectual, and I think this was really something in the 60s or 70s. No, it's kind of an insult, and people from other countries, they say, oh, there is this tradition of the French intellectual, but I think in France it's just an old thing, an old dream, an old utopia. I don't. So
really,
I share some hope. I'm very optimistic, but not for this reason. And I love philosophy. It's not the problem. But I don't see lights in this direction, in particular in our context, in management and doc studies. Should this be the French or not context? And intellectuality, that's very sad, but intellectuality, that's...
Well, thank you, François, for everything.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Varda. Thank you, Gibson, for your time, your presentation, and this fascinating discussion. And for those who want to follow the next session of our open seminar, let's meet in May. It will be a discussion with Ian Munro, Emily, and me about nomadology. We'll talk about a big French intellectual, Gilles Deleuze, and other ones, Guattari and other ones. And so let's meet in May for this third discussion in the context of our open seminar. Thanks to all of you. See you soon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.